The Warlord laughed as the last light of the dying sun bled across the valley, painting ruined stone and twisted metal in shades of rust and gold. His laughter carried easily, confident and cruel, the sound of someone who had never been forced to doubt his own power. Behind him stood ranks of armored soldiers, their weapons angled forward, their faces hidden, their stillness rehearsed. They had burned cities together, erased resistance together, and learned that fear was the most reliable language in the universe. Illyra Vance stood alone before them. She was smaller than he expected, her frame thin beneath torn civilian clothing, wrists marked where restraints had bitten into skin. Dust clung to her boots, and dry blood darkened the fabric at her shoulder. She should have been kneeling. She should have been screaming. Instead, she stood straight, eyes level with his, and wore a quiet, infuriating smile. The Warlord narrowed his eyes, studying her as one might study a malfunctioning device. "You are aware," he said slowly, "that you are standing at the center of my army." Illyra nodded once. "I know where I am." "You know what I am," he continued. "And you know what happens to those who defy me." "I know what you believe happens," she replied. A ripple of unease moved through the nearest soldiers. The Warlord noticed and felt irritation coil in his chest. He had conquered 12 systems by breaking spirits before bodies. This woman's calm was an inconvenience. "You were captured while aiding evacuations," he said. "A coordinator, not a fighter. No weapons, no authority. Yet people listened to you." "They were afraid," Illyra said. Someone needed to speak. The Warlord laughed again, louder this time, stepping closer until his shadow fell across her face. "And you think speaking will save you now?" "No," she answered gently. "I think listening might save you." Silence followed, heavy and unfamiliar. The wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of ash and ozone. The Warlord's fingers flexed near his weapon. "You humans," he said, "cling to hope like it is strength. Hope dies quickly." Illyra's smile did not fade. "Hope is not what kept us standing." "Then what did?" he demanded. "Each other." The word hung between them, simple and defiant. The Warlord straightened and turned slightly, gesturing to the endless line of soldiers behind him. "This," he said, "is power, unity enforced by fear. You stand against it alone." Illyra followed his gesture, her gaze sweeping across the army, the banners, the distant silhouettes of warships hovering like predators above the valley. When she looked back at him, there was sorrow in her eyes, not fear. "I am not alone," she said. The Warlord's patience snapped. "Enough," he barked. "Your defiance ends here." He raised his hand, the universal signal for execution. "Kill her." The command echoed. No shots followed. Confusion flickered across his face as seconds stretched. He turned sharply toward his soldiers. "Why do you hesitate?" None answered. Several stared upward, weapons lowering despite themselves. A low vibration rolled to the ground, subtle at first, then undeniable, like distant thunder beneath stone. Illyra closed her eyes briefly, breathing out as if releasing a long-held weight. The Warlord followed their gaze to the darkening sky, and for the first time since his rise to power, uncertainty crept into his thoughts. Whatever was coming, he realized, had already begun. He searched the horizon, expecting explosions or enemy formations, but saw only the slow gathering of motion, the kind that suggested intention rather than chaos. Instruments on his command display flickered, as if struggling to interpret what they sensed. Around him, discipline frayed. Veterans who had marched through fire now shifted uneasily, hands trembling despite years of conditioning. They had learned to trust his certainty, and that certainty was cracking. Illyra opened her eyes and met his gaze once more. There was exhaustion there, deep and human, but also resolve sharpened by loss. "You wanted an ending," she said quietly. "This is only the beginning." Her words were not a threat. They were a statement, delivered with the calm of someone who had already accepted the cost. The Warlord felt the moment slip beyond his control, like sand through clenched fingers. Whatever force was approaching had been invited, prepared, woven together long before this confrontation. He understood then that the smile he had mocked was not defiance born of ignorance, but confidence born of faith in others. As the sky continued to darken, He realized he was no longer facing a prisoner, but the opening move of a far greater resistance. The moment stretched, heavy with consequence, inviting the future forward, daring every soul present to choose who they would become when fear finally failed, and hope rose where obedience once lived. Illyra Vance had never imagined herself as a symbol. She was a logistics coordinator by training, a problem solver who preferred lists of speeches and quiet efficiency to praise. Before the invasion, her days were spent rerouting supply convoys, calming frightened colonists, and fixing small failures before they grew large. She believed wars were won by preparation and lost by arrogance, and she trusted systems more than heroes. That belief did not make her brave, but it made her steady, and steadiness was what people reached for when the sky filled with enemy fire. When the first Warlord ships pierced the atmosphere, Illyra was in the eastern relay hub, coordinating evacuations with a voice kept deliberately calm. She watched feeds of cities collapsing and ships burning, and she made choices that would haunt her forever, choosing who could be saved first and who would have to wait. She learned quickly that fear was contagious, but so was resolve. Every time her voice steadied, others followed, and every time she hesitated, panic crept in. So she did not hesitate. The Warlord studied her past while his forces secured the valley. He learned she had no military rank, no command authority, no combat record. That made her persistence insulting. He expected humans to fracture once leadership fell. Yet resistance reorganized around voices like hers, ordinary people who refused to vanish quietly. He ordered her captured not because she was dangerous in the traditional sense, but because she represented something he could not quantify. He believed removing her would collapse whatever fragile morale remained. Illyra understood the risk the moment soldiers surrounded her. She did not resist, not because she had surrendered, but because she knew her role had shifted. Even in restraints, she observed patrol timings, communication delays, and the subtle overconfidence in her captors' routines. She listened more than she spoke, storing details, waiting for moments when a word could matter. Her strength was never physical. It was connective. She linked frightened people together, even when separated by walls, distance, or despair. The Warlord believed unity required obedience. Illyra believed unity required trust. That difference shaped everything that followed. Where he imposed silence, she encouraged communication. Where he punished initiative, she cultivated it. Human networks adapted beneath occupation, forming patterns too fluid to crush completely. Messages passed through civilian channels, through maintenance pings and emergency frequencies, woven carefully enough to look like chaos. To the Warlord, it appeared disorganized. To Illyra, it was alive. Standing before him now, she carried the weight of every voice that had passed through her. She remembered the engineer who stayed behind to keep power running, the medic who refused evacuation until the last patient moved, the pilot who volunteered a civilian ship for a task it would not survive. These were not soldiers, yet they chose sacrifice without being ordered. That knowledge anchored her as the Warlord mocked her confidence and tested her resolve. The Warlord's certainty came from a lifetime of domination. He had learned that most beings broke when faced with overwhelming force. Illyra had learned that humans bent, adapted, and reached for one another when pressed hardest. Neither fully understood the other yet, and that misunderstanding sharpened the tension between them. He saw her smile as delusion. She saw his certainty as a weakness waiting to be exposed. As the ground began to tremble beneath distant movement, Illyra felt the shift before she saw it. The network she trusted was responding, not with panic, but coordination. She did not know the outcome, only that humanity had chosen to answer together. That was enough. When she met the Warlord's gaze again, her calm was no longer an act. The moment had passed the point of retreat, and the future was moving toward them, step by inevitable step. The Warlord turned from Illyra and faced his command staff, irritation sharpening his features as tremors continued beneath their feet. Reports arrived in fragments, overlapping voices struggling to impose order on readings that defied expectation. Sensors detected mass signatures without standard formation, propulsion patterns inconsistent with known fleets, and energy fluctuations that suggested cooperation rather than hierarchy. The Warlord dismissed the first report, then the second, until repetition forced his attention. Uncertainty spread outward from him like a stain, touching officers trained never to doubt. Ilera watched silently, noting the subtle changes. Soldiers shifted their weight. Weapons dipped a fraction. The Warlord's army had been conditioned to respond to certainty, not ambiguity, and ambiguity was blooming everywhere. She recognized the signs because she had seen them in frightened civilians before evacuation ships lifted. The difference was that fear here was paired with confusion, and confusion weakened discipline faster than terror ever could. The Warlord demanded clarity, his voice rising as if volume alone could restore dominance. His officers tried to comply, feeding impartial truths wrapped in cautious language. They spoke of human vessels emerging across multiple vectors, not converging but coordinating, covering one another without a visible command node. They spoke of civilian craft reinforced beyond expectations, of shields layered with redundancy rather than raw strength. None of it matched the doctrines he had spent decades mastering. Ilera felt a quiet ache as confirmation settled in her chest. Humanity had come, not as a single blade, but as a living net. She had hoped, trusted, and now she saw the result. It was not flawless, not elegant, but it was sincere, and sincerity carried a momentum no tyrant could easily halt. She understood that this response was not about her rescue alone. It was about refusing to abandon anyone, even those already lost. The Warlord finally turned back toward her, suspicion replacing mockery. "You did this," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. "I helped," Ilera replied. "Others did the rest." He studied her face, searching for arrogance or triumph, but found only fatigue and resolve. That unsettled him more than defiance would have. He had broken champions before. Ordinary people who endured were harder to understand. His grip tightened on his weapon, not from rage, but from a creeping sense of imbalance. Above them, the sky darkened further as human ships filled the horizon. They did not announce themselves with threats or demands. Instead, open channels carried simple declarations of presence and intent, requests for ceasefire, offers of medical assistance, warnings delivered calmly, without malice. The Warlord scoffed outwardly, but inwardly he felt something unfamiliar press against his certainty. Mercy as strategy was a concept he had long dismissed, yet it was unraveling his calculations in real time. On the ground, human prisoners straightened as they heard the transmissions. Some wept openly. Others closed their eyes in relief. Ilera saw shoulders lift, breath steady, hope rekindled not as fantasy but as reinforcement. The Warlord noticed as well, and his anger sharpened into something brittle. Control was slipping, not through rebellion, but through solidarity he could not suppress. He raised his weapon deliberately, forcing focus back onto the immediate threat he understood. "This ends now," he said, aiming at Ilera with practiced precision. "Your network dies with you." Ilera did not move. She felt fear, sharp and human, but it did not rule her. She thought of the voices she had carried, the trust placed in her, and the knowledge that even her death would not sever what had already formed. She met his gaze without hatred. "You still don't understand," she said softly. "This isn't about me." For a moment, the valley held its breath. The Warlord hesitated, caught between instinct and uncertainty, between an old certainty and a new reality pressing in from every side. The hesitation, brief but real, marked the first true fracture in his authority, and it was enough to promise that whatever followed would change them all forever. The Warlord's finger tightened, and the weapon discharged with a sharp crack that split the air. Ilera saw the flash, felt the heat, and then the impact never came. A human soldier surged forward from the edge of the formation, moving on instinct alone, placing his body between her and the shot. The blast tore through him, throwing him to the ground, and the sound of his armor striking stone echoed louder than the weapon itself. Time seemed to fold inward as he fell, and the valley froze around that single, irreversible moment. Ilera dropped beside him without hesitation, hands trembling as she pressed him against the wound she already knew was fatal. His eyes were wide, unfocused, but when they found her face, recognition flickered. He tried to speak, failed, and exhaled one last breath that carried no fear, only urgency. She closed his eyes gently, absorbing the weight of a life spent in choice rather than obedience. Around them, A sound began to rise, not a scream, but a collective intake of breath that preceded action. The warlord recoiled as if struck, his certainty shattering under the consequences of his decision. He had expected terror, retreat, submission. Instead, the human response ignited like a storm. Channels erupted with voices, names spoken aloud, stories shared in fragments, each one affirming that the fallen soldier had mattered. The air vibrated with coordinated movement as human forces advanced with sudden, unified purpose, no longer restrained by hope alone but galvanized by loss. Above, human ships shifted formation with fluid precision, disabling enemy vessels through targeted strikes that severed command pathways without annihilation. Boarding teams moved swiftly, neutralizing control centers and securing crews with efficiency tempered by restraint. Medical vessels surged forward, opening bays not only to human wounded, but to enemy casualties as well. The warlord watched his empire unravel, not in fire, but in the systematic removal of his ability to inspire fear. On the ground, soldiers loyal to him faltered as their weapons were gently but firmly taken from their hands. Some resisted briefly, then stopped when offered aid instead of punishment. The warlord shouted orders that went unanswered, his voice cracking as authority drained from it. Ilera rose slowly, grief etched into her posture, yet her gaze remained steady. She had lost someone she did not know, and that loss bound her more tightly to every human present. The warlord charged toward her in desperation, rage replacing strategy. He was intercepted instantly by multiple hands, human and unyielding, holding him back without striking. He struggled, roaring defiance, but there was no triumph in his voice now, only disbelief. Ilera stepped closer, close enough that he could see the cost reflected in her eyes. "This is what you never learned," she said quietly. "Power fades. Responsibility remains." He spat a curse, demanding death rather than restraint, but no one obliged him. Restraints replaced weapons, not as trophies, but as necessities. The warlord was forced to look around at the faces surrounding him, faces marked by exhaustion, grief, and resolve. These were not conquerors celebrating victory. They were people ending a threat, because it had to end. As silence settled, broken only by distant engines and quiet sobs, Ilera returned to the fallen soldier. She stood there a moment longer, committing his sacrifice to memory. The warlord was dragged away, still struggling, still shouting, but his words no longer commanded attention. The valley belonged to those who remained, and the cost of standing together was written plainly before them. Ilera straightened, shoulders heavy but unbroken. She knew the fight was not over, only transformed. What came next would demand rebuilding rather than resistance, accountability rather than vengeance. As human forces secured the ground and tended the wounded, she felt the future pressing forward, uncertain yet possible. The warlord's reign had ended not with his death, but with his irrelevance, and that truth lingered, urging every witness to decide what they would build from the silence left behind. The war did not end with celebration, because no one present believed loss deserved spectacle. Fires were extinguished, weapons lowered, and silence replaced the thunder that had ruled the valley. Ilera moved among the wounded, offering water, words, and steady presence, her grief contained but not hidden. She felt the absence of the soldier who had fallen for her like a constant ache, a reminder that survival carried obligation. Around her, humans worked without orders, guided by shared understanding rather than command. The warlord was secured within a field restraint, his rage spent, his voice hoarse from shouting at a world that no longer obeyed him. He expected execution, and part of him welcomed it, because death would preserve the illusion of dominance. Instead, he was left standing, forced to watch his army disband under humane supervision. His soldiers were offered medical care, food, and choice, and that choice unsettled him more than chains ever had. Fear had been his tool, and fear had been rendered irrelevant. Human ships remained overhead, not as occupiers, but as guardians ensuring no vacuum of violence followed collapse. Supplies descended alongside engineers and medics, transforming the battlefield into a place of triage and reconstruction. Ilera coordinated again, falling back into familiar rhythms, directing aid where it was needed most. Purpose steadied her, though sorrow lingered beneath every decision. She spoke the fallen soldier's name aloud once, quietly, ensuring he was not reduced to anonymity. The Warlord was brought before her briefly, not for judgment, but for acknowledgment. He met her eyes without defiance now, only confusion threaded with reluctant comprehension. "You spared us," he said, as if the words tasted foreign. Illyra shook her head. "We spared ourselves," she replied. "Becoming what you are would have cost us more." That truth settled heavily between them, and he had no answer. In the days that followed, formal proceedings began, measured and deliberate. The Warlord was transferred to interstellar custody to face judgment that would not be swift, but thorough. He would be required to witness reconstruction, to see worlds he had broken choose cooperation over vengeance. It was not mercy offered lightly, but accountability shaped to prevent repetition. Illyra did not attend the sentencing. Her work remained with the living. She returned to her homeworld months later, changed but intact. Scars marked her body, and quieter scars marked her thoughts, yet neither defined her alone. She resumed coordination roles, training others to build networks resilient enough to endure crisis. When asked about the moment she smiled before an army, she answered honestly. "I trusted people," she said. "They proved me right." Across human space, the story spread, not as legend, but as lesson. Humanity was not invincible, nor uniquely virtuous, but it was stubbornly interconnected. That trait became its signature. Alliances deepened, defenses adapted, and compassion was no longer dismissed as weakness. Illyra sometimes stood beneath open skies, thinking of the valley and the cost paid there. The future remained uncertain, but it was shared, and that sharing was strength enough to face whatever came next. She understood that endings were rarely clean, and that peace demanded vigilance as much as courage. Meetings followed, alliances renegotiated, wounds examined honestly rather than hidden beneath rhetoric. Illyra listened more than she spoke, valuing voices that had once been dismissed as insignificant. Each conversation reinforced the same truth she had carried into the valley. Strength multiplied when shared deliberately. Humanity would fail again someday, she knew, but failure no longer meant isolation. It meant learning together. At night, sleep came unevenly, broken by memories of fire and falling bodies, yet she rose each morning with purpose intact. The Warlord's fate remained unresolved in her mind, not out of sympathy, but because she understood how easily certainty hardened into cruelty. She resolved to teach that lesson where she could, quietly, persistently, without spectacle. If vigilance faded, history would repeat itself, and smiles would not always be enough. Standing at the edge of a rebuilt city months later, Illyra watched ships depart and arrive in equal measure, commerce and compassion, sharing the same lanes. Children laughed where soldiers once marched, and that sound carried farther than any command ever had. She breathed in the ordinary miracle of survival, aware that it existed because countless people had chosen connection over fear. The story was not finished, only handed forward, waiting for the next moment when humanity would again be asked who it was, and who it wished to become. That question lingered beyond borders and stars, binding strangers into a shared responsibility that no single leader could command, only nurture, reminding Illyra that the truest victories were measured not by enemies defeated, but by futures protected together, in hope, vigilance, humility, and enduring commitment to one another across time and space.